Thanks for tuning in to In Progress. This episode is about climate justice. I'm coming to this conversation as someone who, like most of us, worries about climate change on a daily basis. We are already experiencing its catastrophic effects. In this episode, we will speak to Professor Leonardo Figueroa Helland about how climate justice and indigenous sovereignty are inextricably linked. Leo is an associate professor and the chair of the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management program here at the New School. Currently, he leads the Indigeneity and Sustainability section of the Tishman Environment and Design Center. Leo, thanks so much for joining us.
Good day, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leonardo Figueroa Helland. I'm originally from Mesoamerica. I'm an arrivant in Turtle Island. I currently reside in the unceded land of the Lenape people, known as Lenape-Hoking, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. Thanks, Bianca.
Thank you so much, Leo, for joining us. So I'd like to first start out with the relationship between the Earth's biodiversity and indigenous communities. So I have a quote to share. Around 80% of the Earth's remaining yet rapidly declining biodiversity is found within 20% of the planet's terrestrial surface that is still under formally recognized indigenous management, tenure, or occupation, which, by the way, is continuously threatened. This correlation is no coincidence, and it makes the case as to why the world should be following the lead of indigenous communities. Could you give us some statistics of how indigenous stewardship has nurtured biodiversity? So, for example, indigenous tended forests have slower or no deforestation or degradation.
Certainly. One point to underline is that lands that are held by indigenous peoples have shown greater biodiversity and better biodiversity conservation outcomes than conserved lands that are demarcated and protected by states such as national parks. So even in comparison to formally conserved areas or protected areas, indigenous lands show greater density and richness of biodiversity. One point to underline is that indigenous peoples have been shown not just to maintain the levels of biodiversity, but furthermore to nurture and enhance the levels of biodiversity. As for food diversity and resiliency across the world, it has so far been documented that indigenous knowledges have creatively enhanced agrobiodiversity, nurturing at least 1,400 new species and countless varieties. In the question of enhancing biodiversity, the principle of indigenous knowledge is, richness in diversity and complementarity constitutes resiliency. And it's what ensures the cyclical regeneration of the basis of life, the land, right?
So this is why when we talk about restoring Earth's biodiversity, which is a key effort in reducing climate catastrophe, we must talk about, as you say, defending, returning, reconstituting, and rematriating indigenous nations and territories. They're one and the same. You just mentioned it, and it's something that I'd like to talk about more, which is indigenous knowledges. I'd like to hear some examples of indigenous knowledges, but also I'd love for you to share some of the guiding principles that are at the core of these.
Certainly, Bianca. It's important to understand that indigenous knowledges, the principles of indigenous knowledges emerge from the land base and the situated experience of different indigenous cultures, right? There is no easy way to generalize. Every single indigenous culture nurtures its intimate relationships to their local community of life in accordance to thousands of years of interaction and, to getting to know each other. The land nurtures you, you nurture the land. And the way in which society organizes itself in relation to that specific land base will vary from context to context, although the principles may be shared, right? So I'd like to obviously point out to the place where I'm located, currently the northeast of Turtle Island, as an example of how this works. Over the course of thousands of years, at least 6,000 to 8,000 years, the indigenous peoples of the northeast of Turtle Island, such as Haudenosaunee, Lenape peoples, were known to nurture what we call forest garden systems. Forest garden systems that were characterized by a wide diversity of tree species, of shrubs, of ground covers, of medicinal food uses, construction uses, but more importantly, these species not only have a value for humans, but they have a value for the community of life. They were habitats for attracting and maintaining the regeneration of animal species and pollinators and the like. These kinds of landscapes were not recognized necessarily as nurtured landscapes, but as a lot of settlers and colonizers would see them as wild, right? But not really understand that they emerged from a relationship, intimate relationship of mutual knowledge among the landscape and the people. Because for indigenous folks, for us, for ancestors, the landscape has a personhood. She nurtures us and we nurture her in return.
A lot of marginalized communities, we've had to be very creative just to survive. And a lot of people in the environmental justice movement have been very creative in how to articulate what's going on and how to create solutions. My name is Mike Harrington. I am an alum of the Environmental Policy and Sustainability Management program at the New School. My current role is as an assistant director at the Tishman Environment and Design Center. We work on advancing environmental justice both inside of the university and external to the university. A lot of it is trying to basically create this culture of sustainability rooted in environmental justice. We have a lot of creative and driven people that attend the university, so I think it's important that they also gain the literacy to deal with a changing world and do it in a just way. I've done some work around urban heat, which is an environmental justice issue, because it is something that disproportionately affects Black people, specifically Black people in New York and Chicago at least. So I worked with a cohort of about 24 people who are all doing great work in the design, architecture, policy, etc. fields. And we worked to create some guidelines. It's called Turning the Heat. We basically created those as recommendations to give to the city government. The thing that drives me to do this work is my upbringing. When I was a child in Chicago, we had this terrible heat wave in 1995. And usually when you have an urban heat wave in a city like Chicago or New York, you'll see about 100 deaths per summer. But this one summer, 1995, there was a week, and it wasn't even that hot, where about 800 people died in about a week, like I think a 10-day period. It was a very short amount of time. And it disproportionately affected Black neighborhoods. If you look at the statistics, it shows who was affected by this, and it wasn't equal. And if you look at the statistics in New York, who was affected by urban heat or who has the most deaths from that, it's mostly older Black men. But it all goes sort of back to another thing that I feel that I've become somewhat of an expert on, which is history, because I think that's very important to understand how we got here and the way that we got here in terms of a lot of people, especially Black people and other marginalized groups, is through redlining in the United States at least. So redlining creates neighborhoods that don't have a lot of resources. It's really important to understand how those things came about to be able to dismantle them. So that's why I take a very justice-centered approach to the work I do, because people shouldn't have to deal with consequences for things they did not do. How do you move forward from that in a way of doing policy, in a way of doing design that really involves the people that are affected by these things? Climate justice looks like there's something that we talk about here at the Tishman Center and also in labor movements, which is just transition. And it's slightly different in both contexts, but it's related. And that means that we have been able to move away from fossil fuels and other harmful practices to a world and economy that is just, that provides people with dignified means to live, and also is one where we're not harming the environment. And that also has the heavy lift of eradicating things like sexism, racism, transphobia, like homophobia, like all of the different things that hold us back from being a more fair society. It's a big challenge, and even if we want to limit climate change to 1.5 Celsius, that's a Herculean challenge. The recent IPCC report talks a lot about how there is a very slim margin of error. There's almost no margin of error if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So Climate justice really looks like everyone working together to stop this, and also working together to reach out to people and create a fairer society. Now, I don't know how that's going to happen, I'll be honest with you, but it's something I work toward, and I think everyone at the center works toward that because I think we believe that it is possible.
So this brings me to the main point of the episode, if you will, that solutions to climate change already exist. They are found in indigenous knowledges and practices that have been cultivated and sustained for time immemorial. And we can see proof of that today in the Earth's remaining biodiversity. But these solutions are systemic alternatives to the world order that we exist in today, and thus require a paradigm shift, one that is first and foremost anti-colonial, anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, all the things. So talk to me about these solutions and why this paradigm shift is absolutely necessary.
So I first want to speak about the erosion of the actually existing ways of life that make up sustainable solutions, right? Many indigenous peoples are no longer able to live their traditional land-based lifeways in significant places, like in settler colonies in North America and South America. Many of these lifeways have been deteriorated, and people have been forcibly removed, displaced, or have had to migrate and assimilate into living conditions of precarity, like in cities and slums and other kinds of ways. So it's important that we speak not just about thousands of years of indigenous actually existing systems, some of which still remain and are resilient and are resistant, but also the actually existing situation of people who have been subject to systematic colonial, capitalist, patriarchal, and state violence, right? And you cannot have solutions if you continue the processes of forced displacement that have been ongoing since the start of colonialism. You cannot have the resurgence of those solutions if you continue transforming the use of land from sustainable food sovereign, local and indigenous systems into export-oriented monocultures for consumers in cities in the global north, because you're going to continue displacing and eroding these knowledge systems. Anti-colonial means that wherever you see around the world, you have to, in many ways, give the land back, revert the process of colonization, halt the processes of dispossession, put into question the basis of settler states and processes of dispossession that solidify a colonial capitalist property regime where land is seen as an object for extraction and where it's made to produce for export and consumption. It's anti-capitalist because the land cannot be there to serve merely the process of economic growth and accumulation and the globalization of trade and commodity exchange. Land exists for her own right and her own terms according to her own dynamics. We're at the tipping point of hothouse Earth, a point of no return, where the geological conditions of a relatively stable Holocene era will be left behind, and we're going into a period of tremendous climate instability, the likes of which we have never lived in or seen. And you're bankrupting the earth for the sake of productivity now, for the sake of a commodity culture now, for the sake of all of these now. For indigenous peoples, it's about a way of life that ensures the future of your community for 7 or more generations into the future.
I was reminded of one of your other quotes, which is, Mother Earth is not a system to be managed, but a life force that makes us possible. I love how you have said that the things that have caused these crises can't fix or can't be depended on to fix these crises. And so it really is just a complete rethinking of the world order that we live in right now.
Climate justice to me is anti-capitalist. It's about changing the systems in place and our social ideologies in order to create equality for everyone and also ecological justice for our Earth.
corporations are taking action for the damage that they're causing.
Climate justice to me means making sure all the animals stay safe, polar bears over there in the Arctic.
And people from our generation and generations above us using their voices to express our need for good and positive environmental change, and for us to vote for politicians and people in positions of power to enact those positive changes and to lead with a climate-first strategy.
Climate justice to me is about awareness, especially since I feel like when I was growing up, I didn't really know much about it.
It all starts with more education about climate change and making sure that everyone is educated regardless of where they come from.
Everybody doing their part and coming together. Climate justice to me means addressing the racial disparities that are in the climate crisis. So addressing everything from toxicity in water to air pollution, to the rising sea levels.
Creating resilient and equitable futures for everyone, including BIPOC communities that are disproportionately affected by the emission of carbon. I recently founded the Climate Justice Club here at the New School, where we collaborate on creative projects that aim to reduce our carbon footprint and to spread awareness about the climate movement while aiming to amplify BIPOC voices in this cause.
Well, I think we have a responsibility as individuals, as groups, and especially as the next generation to not just passively let the cycle continue. I think that we have to act and educate and inform when we see these injustices continue, because I think that alone we cannot make the same difference as we could as a group, as a community, and we need to act on it.
I want to end on somewhat of an inspiring note, and that is that indigenous resistance is successful. So just one example, and I'm quoting you again here. Indigenous resistance against fossil fuel projects in Turtle Island, so-called North America, has stopped or delayed greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to at least 1/4 of annual US and Canadian emissions, which is fantastic. So how can anyone watching this support these efforts of indigenous resistance and climate mitigation?
Yes, well, thanks for pointing that out. It is important to underline that frontline indigenous resistance on site, in the frontiers of extraction, in forests, in mineral deposits, where pipelines are being built, where forest carbon projects are being expanded, where biofuel plantations are being expanded, where hydropower is being expanded just upstate, and in Quebec, hydropower being driving displacement of the Inuit people to fuel New York City, right? So these sort of frontline projects is where indigenous peoples have resisted for a long time, and that resistance has proven to be more effective than the whole apparatus of intergovernmental policymaking around trying to withhold the pace of biodiversity loss or climate destruction. So, so for people who want to understand this process, there are some caveats that I would point out there's things you probably shouldn't do. One thing is, when you engage with indigenous struggles and indigenous knowledges, do not romanticize them or abstract them from their political context of struggle, resistance, violence, and mobilization. Engaging with indigenous knowledges is a very enriching affair because of the wealth of practical, theoretical, spiritual knowledge that is assigned to them. But a lot of people are attracted to this because it's beautiful to learn about wild rice, about sacred cacao trees, about communal organized, community organized. It's beautiful to learn about spirituality, but it's not as palatable to understand that one may be, as of today, living and being complicit in a system of, say, settler colonialism or market capitalist reproduction that is on a day-to-day basis destroying these ways of life. So we cannot just pick and choose pieces of indigenous knowledge and practice, and what doesn't challenge, say, my complicity in colonialism, my complicity in capitalism, my complicity in land grabbing, and just extract the pieces, such as, how do we do a sustainable food system on indigenous land without giving the land back to indigenous peoples, right? So it's important to join efforts to stand side by side with Indigenous peoples in terms of the interests that are a priority to Indigenous peoples today. The rollback of land dispossession, struggles for land back and land rematriation, the defense of Indigenous sovereignty, directly confronting extractive industries, and directly confronting the financiers that bankrolled extractive industries, those who bankroll the pipelines, those who bankroll the biofuel industry, those who bankroll the agribusiness industry, the mining industry, directly confronting those industries and the states that support them. That's the best way to start to support the struggles.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think, it is an all hands on deck approach, and especially looking even at the personal level of how you are complicit in these systems and what are you doing in your everyday to dismantle them. Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm just going to tell you right now that I'm going to sign up for your classes because I can't wait to learn more. But yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks to you, Bianca.